Good day. As we approach Christmas and the New Year, Russian President Putin continues his intense schedule. Over the last couple of hours, he's had an election meeting with his United Russia Party, members of his United Russia Party. He met members of the parliamentary factions of the Duma a few days ago. And the follow-up, the meeting with the United Russia Party should be seen in that context and in the context of the Russian presidential elections, which are taking place in March. He made a speech which was exclusively focused, so far as I can see, on domestic matters. Then, a few hours later, he went to the Russian Defense Ministry, where he addressed the Collegium, or board, of the Russian Ministry of Defense. And there's quite a lot of pictures of this meeting, and large numbers of senior military people were there. It seems that a lot of top people in the Russian military system were invited to attend. And this was a long presentation, and the Kremlin, as at the time of making of this program, has not yet provided us with a complete transcript of what Putin said. So I'm going to defer full discussion of what I suspect was a very important speech by Putin till my next program. What I will say is that Putin does seem to have once again gone over the major geopolitical topics. He's talked about the deterioration in the relationship between Russia and the United States and Russia and the European Union. He's spoken about how Russia was apparently outplayed in Ukraine by the West after 2014, that the West made all kinds of promises again, which were not honoured. He also put that in the greater context of Western promises at the end of the Cold War not to expand NATO eastward. And he's pointed out that NATO is indeed expanding eastward and is also taking further steps, by the way, and in parenthesis, in violation of other undertakings also given to the Russians at various times, by positioning more and more of its forces closer and closer to Russia's borders. In fact, what might be in some respects the most provocative and extraordinary step taken up to this point was confirmed yesterday. The German Defense Minister Boris Pistorius and the Lithuanian government have now spoken about a German armoured brigade being permanently stationed in Lithuania from 2027. Lithuania, of course, having been a constituent republic of the Soviet Union between 1940 and 1991. So I don't know whether Putin talked about this, but no doubt he will. No doubt he did. And maybe he also talked about the increasing talk of NATO forces being deployed to Finland as well, a country which, after the end of the Second World War, after the Second World War, the Soviet Union agreed a peace treaty which appeared to commit Finland to a policy of neutrality. Now, as I said, he talked about these geopolitical issues. He talked about the updating of the armed forces. He talked about the military situation in Ukraine. I understand that he made it again clear that the southeastern regions of Ukraine, Donbass, presumably Kharkiv, Ukraine's Black Sea coast, Odessa. So these are Russian regions. I don't know whether he spoke further about potential future arrangements for the rest of Ukraine. I'll have to see the entire transcript of his statements before I see that. And it seems Putin also spoke at length about the performance of the Russian armed forces. He was unsurprisingly lavish in his praise, but he also identified all sorts of areas where improvement was needed. ISR, intelligence and reconnaissance, needs to be improved. Russia needs to have more satellites in space to keep track of what's happening, not just in Ukraine, but in all sorts of other places. It needs to refine and update even further coordination between its intelligence and reconnaissance systems and its artillery and aviation forces. And he also spoke at length about developing and increasing Russia's drone capabilities and made it clear that this is now a high priority. Now, that bit of his speech, which the Kremlin has provided us with some a partial readout of, speaks about the increases in weapons production. He said that this year, thanks to the work of the defense industries, the volumes deliveries of armored vehicles increased threefold, 4.5 times. In general, the number of purchased main sample weapons increased by 2.7%, and especially in demand 7 times. And that's all that he said. But after Putin spoke, the Russian defense minister, Sergei Shoigu, spoke, and he gave rather more detailed numbers for Russian weapons production, increases in Russian weapons production. And we have an excerpt of what Shoigu said from the Russian Defense Ministry, and it covers this precise topic. And this is what the Russian Defense Ministry, and it's on its Telegram channel, its official Telegram channel, says that Shoigu said. He said that to meet the needs of the armed forces, companies of the military-industrial complex have quadrupled their capacity, and gone into round-the-clock operation. Since February 2022, production of tanks has increased 5.6-fold, infantry fighting vehicles 3.6-fold, armoured personnel carriers 3.5-fold, unmanned aerial vehicles 16.8-fold, and artillery ammunition 17.5-fold. So Shoigu is saying that Russian artillery production has increased, artillery shell production or production for Russian artillery pieces, presumably tube artilleries and rocket artillery, has increased 17.5 times. Now, I've just been checking out some numbers that the Jamestown Foundation has been giving us. The Jamestown Foundation has been spending all its time since the start of the special military operation trying to persuade us that increases in Russian weapons production are fictitious. A couple of months ago, I analysed in detail one of their articles about Russian artillery production and suggested that it was flawed in many, many respects. You could find that video if you search hard enough. I've dipped and checked out their articles from time to time. pretty much everything that they say strikes me as pretty dubious. But anyway, this is what the Jamestown Foundation says was Russian artillery production at the start of the war. This is pre-2022. And I'm taking this from an article by Pavel Luzin, dated 21st September 2023. So Pavel Luzin in the Jamestown Foundation says, as of that, in this article dated September 2023, regarding artillery shell production, some pre-2022 assessments estimated that Russian production rates stood at 1.14 million a year. From 2014 to 2021, a comprehensive repair program for shells from Soviet storage added another 570,000 rounds per year. Therefore, total estimates came to approximately 1.7 million artillery shells a year, both new and repaired, by 2022. Thus, Russia may indeed have been capable of increasing total annual production to 2 million shells, though given the adjustment presented here, that does not mean it actually doubled production rates. So, Luzin tells us this is based on a response to, I think it was an article in the New York Times about Russia producing 2 million shells a year. He concedes, Luzin concedes, even the Jamestown Foundation concedes, that yes, it's possible that Russia is producing 2 million shells a year, rather grudgingly. And that, by the way, and for the record, as Brian Beletic at the New Atlas repeatedly reminds us, would be double the production that the United States sometimes claims that it might achieve by 2025 or 2027. Well, the timelines seem to differ every so often, but anyway, the United States does seem to be trying to work up to a position where it might be able to produce around 1 million shells a year. And even the Jamestown Foundation concedes that perhaps they've achieved production of 2 million shells a year. And that, based on production of new shells, again according to the Jamestown Foundation, of 1.14 million shells a year. Well, here we have Shoigu telling us that since the start, since February 2022, artillery production of artillery ammunition has increased 17.5-fold. Now, if he's talking about artillery shells, and if we accept these numbers from the Jamestown Foundation, that production of artillery shells by Russia before the conflict began stood at 1.14 million shells. Well, you can do the maths. 1.4 million times 17.5, we start to get quite incredible numbers of between 17 and 20 million shells a year. Now, is this possible? I have to say that if we take these numbers that Shoigu is giving at face value, we are arriving at totals which are so huge that they seem to me to be fantastical. I am not sure what Shoigu means by artillery ammunition. Presumably, he's also talking about production of, say, things like mortar shells, for example. And perhaps if you put everything like that together, you get a figure of an increase of 17.5 times in the total production of every type of projectile that Russian artillery or mortar artillery or whatever, multiple rocket launch systems and those kind of things, might be launching at the Ukrainians. I can't myself believe that Russia has increased production of 152 and 122 millimeter shells and 203 millimeter shells by 17 and a half times. I find figures of Russian artillery production of between 17 and 20 million shells too much, frankly, to believe. I accept it is likely to be much less than this. But there you are. You have Shoigu's numbers. He's given these numbers. He's given these numbers to a meeting of the board of the Russian Ministry of Defense. The people who are listening to him almost certainly do know the actual numbers. Perhaps this is a piece of propaganda intended to deceive people in the West and increase depression in Ukraine. I don't know what the truth is, but one way or the other, it does seem, from what Shoigu is saying, that the Russians are indeed making lots and lots of shells. Mortar shells, mortar rounds, other type of shells, shells for tanks, shells no doubt for infantry fighting vehicles, those kind of things, but probably lots of artillery shells as well. And perhaps if we take the enigma of North Korean deliveries of shells at face value, and there are lots of unanswered questions about that as well. Well, maybe the stockpile of shells is growing even more. Who's to say? Now, the Ukrainians admit that they are desperately short of shells themselves. They're saying that the Russians are able to fire 4 to 5 to 7 times more shells than they can do. The Ukrainians don't tell us how many shells they're firing at any particular day, but from what I've been hearing, it's perhaps around 1,000, 2,000. The Ukrainians are firing 1,000 shells a day, and the Russians are firing 7,000 shells a day, then that is actually a steep reduction in Russian use of artillery shells. But here we have again Shoigu telling us that artillery production is rising 17.5 times. That's, as I said, in the official Telegram channel of the Russian Ministry of Defense. And with all caveats, it's likely that a lot of this is heavy caliber shells for tube artillery, 152 millimeter and 122 millimeter shells and 203 millimeter shells. And of course, there could be shells also supplied by North Korea. What that all points to, assuming that the Ukrainian claims are true, is that the Russians are stockpiling. And that is consistent with everything else we have been seeing from the Russians up to this point, that they're piling up men and machines on Ukraine's borders in unprecedented numbers, hundreds of thousands of men, thousands of tanks, thousands of infantry fighting vehicles. The West concedes that they appear to be stockpiling missiles, long-range missiles, and given what Shoigu is saying, it looks like they're stockpiling shells as well, artillery ammunition as well. Now, I want to reiterate, I want to emphasize this because a lot of people are talking about the developments, the military developments in Ukraine. I do so myself. Every day I discuss the latest news as I can understand it from the battlefronts. By the way, I feel I have to do that. Obviously, it is not an area which I'm expert in at all, but I would find it extremely strange to talk about a war and not talk about the military developments that are taking place over the course of that war. But the key thing to understand, the key point that I want to make now is this. Whatever it is that we are seeing happen at various places on the front line, in Bakhmut or Avdiivka, say, it is important to understand that all of this is not so much a dress rehearsal, but perhaps an overture to the big move that is probably eventually coming. So if the Ukrainians are hard-pressed in Avdiivka, as they are, if they're on the retreat in the Bakhmut area, as they also are, it remains the case that the major Russian blow, which is going to be potentially multiple times greater than anything we've seen up to now, well, that hasn't landed yet. Perhaps the Russians don't intend that it should. Perhaps this massive build-up is partly intended to balance off against NATO forces further in Europe. I personally think that the Russians will deploy some of these forces, perhaps even the greater part of these forces, to eventually resolve the conflict in Ukraine, one way or the other. But anyway, we'll have to wait and see. But the fact is that the potential to use them in that way is there, and if they are used, well, it will fundamentally change the entire landscape on the battlefield. So I wanted to make those points before I go more deeply into the events of the last 24 hours. We've had these astonishing figures from Shoigu. Perhaps they're astonishing because they're not true. I think it would be unwise myself to make that assumption. And anyway, the fact that hundreds of thousands of men have been called up or have joined the army in Russia, that Russian military production is increasing, that is no longer disputed by anyone now. So, what has been happening over the last 24 hours in the conflict itself? Well, before I actually do talk about that, I'd like to talk about something that is directly connected to the conflict, but which didn't take place in Ukraine or in Russia. It took place in Washington. In Washington, last week, there was, as we all remember, lots of discussion about whether the House of Representatives and the Senate would vote a further appropriation for Ukraine. In the event, it didn't happen. Speaker Johnson decided that the House of Representatives should rise, and it's now on its winter break. But Chuck Schumer and Mitch McConnell agreed between them that working parties from the Senate would continue to work this week to see whether some kind of compromise, some kind of understanding within the Senate might be reached this week, which would enable the Senate at least to vote an appropriations package for Ukraine before the Christmas holiday. Well, the Wall Street Journal now tells us that this working party has been meeting, but that no agreement has been reached. The two sides are as far apart as ever. In fact, reading the account in the Wall Street Journal, it seems that the skepticism amongst Republicans, amongst senators, Republican senators, has only increased. Of course, some of these senators, people like J.D. Vance, have been straightforward and, quite open about their deep doubts about continued funding for Ukraine. And perhaps the world's best known Republican has now, on his side, also weighed in, Donald Trump, who's also working towards a presidential run. Apparently, he's now also made it clear that if he's elected president, further funding for Ukraine will certainly end. That will be the end of US funding for Ukraine. And perhaps that is having some influence on some Republicans, not just in the House of Representatives, but in the Senate as well. More important, I suspect, is general feeling amongst the Republican grassroots, amongst Republican voters. They're becoming deeply skeptical about Joe Biden's Ukraine war, as apparently they see it. And it seems that amongst Republicans, both in the country and in Congress, opposition to further funding for Ukraine has just grown. And the Pentagon, for its part, is now saying that there's only $1 billion left of funding previously voted by Congress to provide funding for Ukraine. The various accounting tricks that were used over the course of this year have now apparently been exhausted. And interestingly enough, if I've understood what the Pentagon is saying correctly, the Pentagon is now saying that the $1 billion that's left will not be spent actually buying weapons for Ukraine. It will be spent in order to replenish the Pentagon's own, all but exhausted, arsenals of critical weapons. Now, if all of this is to be taken at face value, then it seems that after the new year, further funding for Ukraine from the United States will finally come to a stop. Congress, of course, will reconvene at the end of January. There could be more discussions about whether to resume funding for Ukraine in late January or February. It may be that between now and then there might be a major sea change. Who's to say? As I said, I'm not an expert, that kind of expert on American politics. It takes people who have much more up-to-date knowledge, much more of a feel for these sort of things than I have, and knowledge from within the United States to be able to say. People like Robert Barnes or Daniel McAdams, for example, the Ron Paul report, they're the sort of people who can probably give us a better sense of what might happen in the United States in terms of funding for Ukraine. But for the moment, at least, it's looking significantly less likely that Ukraine is going to get much, or perhaps any more funding from the United States next year. And that puts everything else in context. Because yes, it's probably true that the European Union will find some mechanism either to circumvent or negate or bully Hungary so that the EU's own aid package of 50 billion euros for Ukraine, which is important to stress, by the way, is intended over a 4-year period. So it provides around 1 billion euros a month, which is probably no more than what Ukraine needs just to keep ticking along. Perhaps it's not even enough of that. And though it's extraordinary to say this, but some of the international agencies, the IMF, the World Bank, believe it or not, the European Bank of Reconstruction and Development, they're all chipping in money for Ukraine. I'm confident that all three of these institutions are in very serious breach of their rules and charters by doing so. But as I've discussed already, it's now become clear that these have become essentially neocon projects themselves. But anyway, the reality is, even if these agencies continue to give funds to Ukraine, even if the European Union cobbles together €1 billion a month for Ukraine for a year or for 4 years or so, the fact is that without the United States, all of this becomes moot. It no longer makes any sense to talk about Ukraine being able to sustain the war. At some point over the course of 2023, without critical US funding, the Ukrainian economy will start to buckle. We'll start to see the Ukrainian government pushed towards printing money in order to meet its payment obligations, and without the endless flow of American weapons. And it's important again to stress that in terms of weapons supply, I believe that some 80% of the weapons Ukraine has received from the West actually do come from the United States. Without military support like that from the United States, which is also, it seems, dwindling away, at some point next year, the crisis will come and it will become clear that Ukraine cannot sustain the war. And the Europeans might be rushing to cobble together funding and arms packages, the Germans especially so. But deep down, they must know it too, that without the United States, this whole thing is hopeless, that there is no prospect, not just of Ukraine achieving victory. I don't think anybody any longer seriously believes that that's a realistic option. But there is no prospect, even in that case, of holding the line. And let me repeat once more that point I made at the start of this program. Even as US aid reduces, perhaps dwindles away, we see from Shoigu's numbers, which might need to be interpreted in all sorts of intricate and complex ways, which perhaps shouldn't be taken entirely at face value. Anyway, we see from Shoigu's numbers, from what we know about the Russian military buildup, that even as Western aid, American aid, reduces to a trickle, Russian military power is growing at an scorching rate. At some point next year, the predominance, the preponderance of force in favor of Russia will become overwhelming. And that now brings me to a very important article in Strana. This is a dissident Ukrainian publication. It's, by the way, in my opinion, the best around. There have been other publications that you can read in Ukraine. There is the Telegram channels, Resident and Legitimi. I'm not completely sure who's behind them and what they're about. I strongly suspect, as I've said previously, that General Zaluzhny, to some extent at least, controls both of these channels, or at least has great influence over them. But Strana is indeed a genuine, independent media publication, newspaper and website. It ran into lots of trouble with Zelensky's government even before the present conflict began. I understand that it operates, it's published now outside Ukraine itself, but nonetheless it clearly is deeply informed about the situation in Ukraine. And for the record, I think it is an excellent publication. I've, in the past, I believe, compared it with Medusa, which is a dissident Russian publication, published, I believe, in Latvia, which does sometimes have some interesting articles, though less so, I have to say, more recently. But to say it frankly, I think Strana is very, very much better publication than Medusa. Anyway, Strana has published a possible set of scenarios as to how Ukraine might conceivably lose the war. And this flows from the various Russian commentaries that I've been talking about, Polyansky, Volodin, Shoigu, Lavrov, others, pointing increasingly to an outcome to the war in which there's either total capitulation by Ukraine or, in effect, the destruction of Ukraine. And Strana has some very interesting points to make. It says that the offensive actions that the Russian troops are now conducting along almost the entire line of the Eastern Front, even if successful, will not mean the defeat of Ukraine. By defeat of Ukraine, we mean the complete military collapse of Ukraine. Even if Avdiivka and Marinka, Kupiansk, Liman and Chasiv Yar are taken, even if the Russian Federation manages to capture the entire Donetsk region, this will not, despite all the painful losses, mean the defeat of Ukraine. And that is absolutely correct. I mean, the Russians can take all of these places, Avdiivka, Marinka, Kupiansk, Liman, Chasiv Yar. It can take Slavyansk and Kramatorsk. It can take Pakrovsk and Vuhledar in Donetsk region. But what is left of Ukraine would still be around 80% of Ukraine. It would be a viable state. It would not be the end in and of itself of Ukraine. And Strana goes on to say, if all of these things that we've just talked about happen, if all of these places are captured, it will only mean moving the front line a certain number of kilometers to the west, where the fighting will continue further, which is sort of true. But of course, if Ukraine loses all of these places, then its main fortified lines in eastern Ukraine will be lost. In previous programs, in earlier programs, I've discussed the extent to which the topography of Donbass, the large number of small towns, the density of population, the urban and industrial landscape makes it an easily fortified and fortifiable area, and that there is nothing quite equivalent to that anywhere else in Ukraine. So I think that Strana perhaps underestimates the seriousness of the loss of Donbass, But, it is nonetheless the case, and I do overall agree that Ukraine, severely weakened as it would be, with much of its military perhaps destroyed, would nonetheless, at least in theory, be able to continue the battle. And then Strana, perhaps rather more controversially, goes on to say that even a hypothetical capture of Ukraine would be extremely difficult, taking into account the industrial and mobilization potential of the city, but not a fatal blow to Ukraine. Well, I don't know whether it would be a fatal blow, but the loss by Ukraine of its second biggest city would be a very severe blow indeed. Personally, I think it would be probably the beginning of the end. But anyway, that's my view. Strana takes a different view. It says that Kharkiv is actually a logistics dead end. Its loss will not create a critical threat to the Ukrainian armed forces communications that are vital for the continuation of the war. I think, as I said, that's a bit complacent if Ukraine were to lose Kharkiv. But then we get the most interesting part of the entire article. Only a few events can bring Ukraine to the brink of complete defeat. And then Strana lists what it thinks they are. 1, the capture of Kiev. 2, the cutting off of Ukraine from the sea, capturing the entire Black Sea coast of the country, and the entry of Russian troops to the borders of Romania and Moldova. This would be a catastrophic blow to Ukraine, both economically and militarily strategically. And then, even more interestingly, the capture of Dnipro and Zaporozhye, the two big urban centers, one in the south, the one in the center of Ukraine, both importantly along the Dnieper. And these are the largest, Strana says, these are the largest rear industrial and logistic hubs of the Ukrainian army, which will mean a critical threat to the entire southern front of the Ukrainian armed forces, as well as most of the eastern. And then the article goes on to say, if the Russians create a bridgehead on the right bank of the Dnieper in this area, they may try to also implement point 2, that is to say, take control of Ukraine's Black Sea coast. They could cut off Ukraine from the sea by attacking through Nikopol and Kryvyi Rog. These are also towns, by the way, on the Dnieper River, which would provide direct access to Transnistria. Then the fourth possibility, which is one, by the way, first floated, to my knowledge, about a year ago by Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis, and which I personally think is the least likely, a strike from Belarus through the Zhytomyr and Vinnytsia regions with the aim of reaching Transnistria from the north. Now, I think that is a very, very high-risk operation, and I don't think it's one that the Russians would countenance. And then Strana goes on to say how realistic are these scenarios. And Strana says that given the current balance of forces, when the Russian army has been storming small towns near Donetsk for almost 2 years, each of them, even the capture of Zaporozhye and Dnipro, located 40 to 100 kilometers from the front line, seems fantastic. Well, except, and I think this is a point which perhaps gets overlooked, in the summer of 2022, the Russians did capture Mariupol, which was a city of 420,000 people before the war. My understanding is that Zaporozhye and Dnipro have populations of around 1 million. So yes, they are bigger places than Mariupol, but we've seen that the Russians, provided they can complete the encirclement of a city, are able to storm and capture it. I'm not saying it would be easy, but especially in the case of Dnipro, which, as I understand, lies on the west bank of the Dnieper, but Zaporozhye is, so I understand, on the left bank of the Dnieper. So if the Russians were to capture it, they might be able to cut it off from resupply across the Dnieper. And it might be that Zaporozhye, at least, could be vulnerable to this kind of assault, a similar assault to the ones that the Russians pulled off successfully in Mariupol. But anyway, that's what Strana says, that, it's difficult to imagine that the Russians could capture these two places. And Strana then admits that the Ukrainian army, as the experience of the summer offensive shown, does not currently have enough forces to liberate the occupied territories, but it is capable of staunchly holding the defense. We'll come to that shortly. And then Strana, very interestingly, discusses the kind of things that might happen, that might change the picture, that might result in a Ukrainian collapse. And it itemizes: one, a catastrophic decline in discipline and morale in the Ukrainian army, when entire units begin to surrender or leave positions without orders. In some ways, that's not so different from the Appomattox courthouse scenario, which I've discussed in previous programs, the event in 1865, April 1865, when General Lee and his Army of Virginia surrendered to the Union forces under General Grant, bringing in effect the American Civil War to its end point. Anyway, that's one. Two, internal destabilization in Ukraine, acute conflict within the military political leadership, loss of control by the authorities over processes in the country, collapse of army control. And we'll come to that in a moment. Three, a fall to a critically low level of both military and financial assistance from the West. And four, a sharp increase by Russia in the size of the army, the quality and quantity of weapons used, which will radically change the balance of forces at the front. And Strana says that at the moment, none of these situations are observed. However, Russia is obviously actively working to make these points a reality. And then Strana again floats the Korean scenario. It also asks whether Russia might be even interested in the Korean scenario. It accepts that if current trends continue, then despite all of the difficulties, the Russians will eventually prevail and will be able to force a total surrender of Ukraine. But Strana suggests that perhaps the strain on Russia of achieving that over a lengthy period might be too great, or perhaps the political leadership in Moscow might consider that it is too great, in which case, conceivably, the Russians might go for a deal. Now, let's just, because I think this is a good and interesting article. Now, I'm not going to discuss the various possibilities about how the Russians might win the war that Strana has outlined. For the record, my own guess is that what the Russians are probably aiming to do is capture Donbass. That's obviously the major priority, and then advance towards the Dnieper, bringing them opposite Dnipro, the city they call Dnipropetrovsk. And I've already discussed in many places why I believe that in geographical terms, in terms of economic geography, that would be a cataclysmic disaster for Ukraine. I also believe that were that to happen, it's difficult to see how Ukraine would be able to sustain its defenses in Zaporozhye and Kharkiv. And I think that were we to arrive at this outcome, the Russians reaching the Dnieper opposite Dnipro, then, as I said, we would be looking at a stage that is bringing us closer, very close by then, to a point of a Ukrainian collapse. And that scenario, the one that I've just outlined, is actually very close to the third scenario discussed by Strana, the capture of the Dnipro and Zaporozhye. I think some people, by the way, who speculate on a Russian advance across the Dnieper River, back into Kherson region, and from then along the Black Sea coast towards Odessa. As I understand it, there are multiple river barriers between the Russian forces and Odessa, including, of course, the Dnieper itself. I think, from what I've understood, this would be a very complex operation, a very difficult operation to execute. And my own view is, as I said, that the primary Russian push will be to reach the Dnieper opposite Dnipro. Anyway, that's my guess. I might be wrong. But let's talk about the circumstances, the events, the circumstances which might bring about, which Strana concedes, might bring about the kind of collapse that we're talking about, Ukrainian collapse that we're talking about. And let's take them one by one. Strana has given us 4 possible things that might cause this Ukrainian collapse. And I'm going to suggest that we are seeing all 4 starting to emerge, and we might be closer to this scenario than perhaps Strana itself realizes. Firstly, a catastrophic decline in discipline and morale in the Ukrainian army. Well, there has been a decline in morale in the Ukrainian army. Even the Western media is admitting this. And so far, this has not taken on catastrophic dimensions, but we are seeing increasing signs of this. There was another video posted yesterday, purportedly from a Ukrainian military unit in the Zaporozhye Verbovoye direction. Now, again, one has to be very careful about these videos. The men who are speaking in this video, who are supposed to be Ukrainian soldiers, could be precisely that, Ukrainian soldiers from a unit in this sector of the front, or it could be that this video is a fabrication cobbled together perhaps by the Russian information machine in order to spread alarm and despondency within Ukraine. Who knows? But for the record, there's been so many videos of this kind, some of them made by Ukrainian soldiers who show their faces in this particular video. They're all masked. I tend to take this particular video also at face value. Anyway, the soldiers in this unit speak about a catastrophic situation in the Rabotino-Verbovoye sector. It is a fact that the Ukrainian forces are being pushed back. They're being pushed back from Rabotino. The Russians are gradually recapturing all of the territory that the Ukrainians captured at such enormous cost over the course of their summer offensive. Soldiers are obviously very bitter and angry about this. They're incredibly critical of President Zelensky and his team, and they're saying that the time has come, perhaps, I'm taking this from other people's accounts of what they said because I obviously don't understand the language, but apparently they're saying that the time has come not for them to turn around and march on Kiev and sort out the situation in Kiev rather than worry too much about the situation on the front lines. They are that angry, supposedly, with President Zelensky's leadership. Now, this particular video, let me repeat again, it may be a fake, but we have seen Ukrainian military units in many parts of the front line also now expressing anger and disquiet about the state of the war, about their way that they're being treated by their high command. We've had two articles, for example, in the Western media by Ukrainian soldiers fighting along the Dnieper in Kherson region, involved in the fighting at the Klinky bridgehead, bitterly complaining to the BBC and to the New York Times about the disastrous situation in the Klinky bridgehead, making it clear that they feel that their lives and the lives of their comrades are being sacrificed for what is essentially nothing more than a PR stunt. And they're very bitter and they're very angry. And though I haven't read it, I believe there's even an article now in the Kiev Independent in which Ukrainian soldiers there say the same thing. So, a scenario of Ukrainian units starting to surrender or leave positions, Ukrainian commanders deciding that the situation has now become unbearable on the battlefronts and that they have to surrender. It's not impossible. In fact, we might be closer to that point than again Strana recognizes. And let me point out that it has happened previously on one earlier occasion in this war. During the fighting in Mariupol, the two military units, Ukrainian military units, a Marine Brigade and the Azov regiment that were surrounded in the Azov-style steel factory, repeatedly requested permission to surrender from the authorities in Kiev. That request was repeatedly refused, and eventually, in despair, the commanders of those two units took the decision into their own hands and without orders from Kiev, surrendered to the Russians. So, it has happened in the past. There are signs that some soldiers, at least on the battlefronts, Ukrainian soldiers, might be starting to think along these lines. It's plausible that some of the commanders are. It's not impossible. It might happen. Internal destabilization in Ukraine, acute conflict within the military political leadership. Well, lots of rumours over the last few weeks of a coup, open disputes between General Zaluzhny and President Zelensky. We've seen one of Zaluzhny's top aides blown up by a grenade from which he pulled a pin. Circumstances of that have not been explained. We've seen Kirill Budanov's wife poisoned. Again, full circumstances of that have not been explained either. We've had rumours that President Zelensky wants to sack General Zaluzhny, and angry refusals from angry statements from Ukrainian military units and political figures saying that they will take strong action if President Zelensky does that. We've had reports, which look like they're real, that General Zaluzhny has rejected a request from President Zelensky that he resign. And we now have the extraordinary, bizarre saga, which I touched on yesterday, of the listening device found in Zaluzhny's office. And by the way, since this program yesterday, the stories that have been told about this listening device have become more and more confusing. So we've had General Zaluzhny himself saying that it was an act of war against him. War by whom? Doesn't say that, but we can all guess who he thinks. We've had the SBU, or some people in the SBU, saying, well, no, definitely it was not a Russian device, but it's no big deal because this listening device apparently wasn't working. We had others suggest that this listening device wasn't even a real listening device. It was something that was made to look like a listening device. I've seen some people suggest that, in fact, it was General Zaluzhny himself who planted this listening device in order to give the impression that he's being victimized by President Zelensky's own office. I don't, by the way, buy that view, but anyway, it is floating around. I don't know what the truth about any one of these stories is. The simple fact is that we've now had another scandal involving a listening device in an office which General Zaluzhny was apparently about to use, with more reports of other listening devices being found supposedly either keeping tabs or not keeping tabs on others of General Zaluzhny's aides. So, yes, we can see signs that there is indeed intense conflict within the military political leadership. We don't know where it's going. We don't know whether it will blow up. We don't know whether the things will continue to be papered over. But it must be having an increasingly debilitating effect. And all the indications are that the pressure is going to increase. And then the third, fall to a critically low level of both financial and military support from the West. Well, again, I come back to what I said earlier part of my program. It seems as if Congress, both the Senate and the House, are now becoming increasingly reluctant to provide further financial and military aid to Ukraine. It looks as if that is dwindling. I don't know how critically low the level has to be, but as I've said already, if aid from the United States ceases, Ukraine's war becomes unsustainable, and I think everybody knows this. And last but not least, a sharp increase by Russia in the size of the army, the quality and quantity of weapons used. Well, again, I've just been talking about that very thing in this program. The huge build-up that is taking place in Russia, the hundreds of thousands of men who've joined the army this year, and we've had all these incredible statistics from Shoigu. You can believe them or not, as you choose. As I said, I'm skeptical about some of them, but all the evidence suggests the Russians building up their forces, stockpiling at an incredible rate, preparing for a massive blow, which eventually will come. So, there we go. We're actually much closer to the kind of scenarios that Strana is talking about than perhaps Strana itself is willing to acknowledge. And talking about the situation on the battlefronts. I will cover those fairly briefly now. Firstly, I should say that Shoigu, in his comments to the Russian Defense Ministry board, put total Ukrainian losses since the start of the special military operation at 383,000, both dead and wounded. Now, that is a huge number, and he also said that 159,000 of these, by my calculations, that's around 40%, were lost over the course of the summer counteroffensive. So that gives you a sense of the enormous scale of the defeat Ukraine suffered this summer. But I would point out that this looks to me like a realistic figure from Shoigu. It's far less than some of the incredible numbers I've seen some people come up with. 1 million plus Ukrainian dead and wounded. Shoigu puts them far less. He's made it clear that it's both dead and wounded. I think these are probably reasonably accurate figures, and they're the ones I'm going to stick with. So there we go. Dead and wounded, according to Shoigu, Ukrainians, 383,000. The point is, Ukraine can't replace them. Shoigu said Ukraine's had 11 mobilizations. It's now undertaking its 12th. The quality of men and women that it is now recruiting are not up to what is needed to sustain this sort of war. But what is actually going on the battlefronts? Well, a couple of days ago, in his press conference, a press conference which, by the way, according to some reports, 75% of Ukrainians with internet access actually watched. Again, an astonishing figure, if it's true, but I don't know whether or not it's true. But if it is true, by the way, it might in itself signal something. Perhaps they're looking to hear what their great enemy is saying, or perhaps they're looking to hear what their future leader might be saying, or perhaps it's a combination of the two, who's to say. But anyway, over the course of that press conference, Putin said that despite the fact that the Russian military have been treating the Klinky bridgehead along the Dnieper in Kherson region as a fire sack, Shoigu and Gerasimov have decided that the time has come to wrap this affair up and that they're taking steps to reduce it. And there's now been a lot of reports which suggest that the bridgehead, the Klinky bridgehead, has now been roughly halved in size. Dima at the Military Summary Channel gives a fairly good and detailed account of this. So, bad news for the Ukrainians, I suppose, that the Dnieper, the Ukrainian soldiers will probably be relieved if this bridgehead is finally extinguished and that they aren't still sent to reinforce it and die there in the huge numbers that they've been doing up to this point. Anyway, that's Klinky. In the Rabotino-Verbovoye area, the Russians, as I said, are now gradually, systematically recovering all the ground lost during Ukraine's counteroffensive, and they seem to be edging towards a full reoccupation of Rabotino. In the Avdiivka area, more reports of the Russians advancing both deeper into the interior of the town itself and fighting bitter battles for this place, Pervomaivske, to the southwest of Avdiivka, and along Stepovoye and Berdichi to the northwest, And there's further reports that the Russians are actually now pushing up and advancing along the railway line northwards towards the heights, and that this operation that the Russians are conducting there continues to be progressing. We've heard less about Marinka itself, but again, lots of reports that this large village, Novomikhailovka, is about to be captured by the Russians. This is this village to the south of Marinka. And again, Dima at the Military Summary Channel has a good update about this, but it looks as if the Russians have now entered Novomikhailovka, that they're in the process of capturing or have already captured the small industrial area to the south of this village, that they're in process of entering it from the west. I noticed that our old friend Yan Gagin, Pushilin's advisor in the Donetsk People's Republic, he says that the situation in Novomikhailovka is progressing as well. He says things are different for the enemy near Novomikhailovka. The Ukrainian forces were forced to withdraw from a number of positions on the first line of defense and go deep. So he appears to be confirming significant Russian advances in Novomikhailovka. And it seems that the Russians are now making big advances, very big advances in the Bakhmut area, that they've pushing hard. They've managed to capture all the heights around Klashevka. They've consolidated within Bogdanovka, which is being deeply contested. They've apparently recaptured the dacha, the country cottage area to the west of Bakhmut. Interestingly, the soldiers who are fighting there appear to be a unit of former Wagner fighters, which has been reconstituted into a new unit, and also apparently Chechen fighters are also located in that particular area, and they're fighting side by side. And there are reports that the Russians are not only pushing further towards Chasiv Yar. The latest maps I've seen, by the way, call into question the earlier claim that the Russians were within 4 kilometers of Chasiv Yar. I was a bit skeptical about it. It's clear to me that they're some distance further from Chasiv Yar than that. But anyway, they seem to be pushing hard towards Chasiv Yar. And more importantly, they are now apparently approaching Ivanivska, the village the Russians called Krasnoye, which, alongside Bogdanovka, is the only village amongst the ring of villages that the Wagner group and the Russians have never captured, and which, if the Russians do capture, will definitely open up the road to Chasiv Yar. So, Russians making big advances there. And reports also that the Russians are now firmly entrenched in Sinkovka, the village to the west of Kupiansk. They control the northern part of this village. There's again, a bit like in Stepovoye, a bitter encounter battle going on between the Russians and the Ukrainian troops there. But the Ukrainians are taking heavy losses. No doubt the Russians are too, but the Russians can absorb them. So overall, the battle remains, the trend in the battle continues to go very much in Russia's favor. So, I come back to that article by Strana. Strana clearly has published this article. Remember, the people who publish for Strana are Ukrainians, and I have no doubt deeply patriotic Ukrainians who love their country. They're trying to say that It's still a long way off before Ukraine capitulates completely or before the Russians are able to force Ukraine to capitulate completely. But if you compare the wider realities, the surge in Russia's military build-up, the decline in US support for Ukraine, the decline, by the way, in Western support for Ukraine, the increasing demoralization of Ukrainian troops, the bitter feuding between Zelensky and Zelensky, and the deteriorating political situation in Kiev itself, and the trend on the battle lines, we see we're actually much closer to meeting the criteria that Strana has outlined for setting the stage for a Ukrainian collapse than Strana appears, for the moment at least, to acknowledge. Now, other things are going on in the world, and it's fascinating to see how the USS Eisenhower, having been deployed to the Persian Gulf, is now being hurriedly redeployed to the Gulf of Oman. Lots of warships of Western navies are now concentrating in the Red Sea, where the Houthis, I will continue to call them Houthis, I believe they don't like that term. Ansala is apparently what they like to call themselves, but Houthis is what most people know them as. Anyway, the Houthis are busy attacking commercial shipping in support of the Palestinians in Gaza, and it is increasingly looking as if a naval crisis of some kind is happening there. And as a commentator in the Daily Telegraph pointed out, it makes no sense for the Western powers to allow most of their navy, or large parts of their navy, to be tied down in the Red Sea indefinitely, protecting merchant shipping. So at some point, some kind of military strike against the Houthis in Yemen starts to look extremely likely, unless there's some kind of a settlement of the conflict in Gaza itself. And there are lots of reports now of intense discussions underway in the Security Council, this time about putting together a ceasefire resolution. And the United States appears to be participating in these discussions, which suggests that someone in the United States might be looking for some way to agree to a ceasefire resolution. I'm going to discuss all of this in my next program. It is important. There's a lot to talk about there. I'm also going to discuss some other points that have been made about what a total victory for Russia in Ukraine might mean, what the economic effects on Russia itself of such a victory might amount to. But that's all going to have to wait until my next program. What I hope I have illustrated today is that, without meaning to, even Strana is now giving us indicators that we might be, I won't say we're close, but we might be heading towards that scenario of total Ukrainian capitulation. And that Westerners who are in denial about this, which is to say pretty much everybody in Western governments, are being dangerously complacent about this issue. Well, that's my program for today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. links under this video. Don't forget to check out our shop. Get yourself the amazing things that you will find there, our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.